Further debate? The member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Speaker, I'm pleased to debate this motion. The motion leads us to a singular question that this debate is meant to inform and answer. During a crisis, what is the best form of government? Is it a representative, democratic, elected government that is accountable for its actions? Or is it an autocratic government where one person, the Premier, can create laws without debate or affirmation from the people? How we answer that question is vital. For if we agree an autocratic government is best during a crisis, why then, by deduction, is it not best at all times, even without a crisis? Are elected members necessary, or are they only optional? Are 124 members worse at making decisions than a single member? The motion asks you to answer that question. Should we be disregarding the purpose we have all consented to in reopening this legislature? Today we are being asked to reaffirm that Ontario is in a state of emergency. If passed, this would empower the Premier and his delegates to continue to make new, unilateral and arbitrary emergency orders while halting and disregarding the function, purpose and responsibility of this Assembly in the development of public policy. In March, I supported the declaration of an emergency, while understanding that those extraordinary powers that we granted to the Premier were temporary. The House had recessed. The risk of exigent circumstances arising was great, and granting those emergency powers was the prudent and wise path to take at that time. And let us not forget the circumstances back then. There was far more unknowns, far more uncertainty. There was more unknowns than knowns. Confusion was compounded with contradictory statements from the regime in China, from the World Health Organization. We were told one day that the borders should be open, the next day that the borders should be closed. We were told that human transmission was not possible, then that it was. We were told that masks couldn't protect you, but then that they could. All these contradictory statements, misinformation in some cases, and uncertainty dictated and justified while the House was going into recess that the Premier be granted these exigent and extraordinary powers. We also didn't know how it spread fully. We didn't even really fully understand the symptoms. We didn't know if there was immunity or not. We didn't know what the lethality rates were. All these unknowns were present. However, a time comes in a free and just society when the executive must return the powers conferred upon them by this House back to this House. I understand the fear we all have with ending the state of emergency. We fear a second wave. We think that these orders are necessary. And I concur that there's still some level of uncertainty in that the existing orders ought to remain in place. However, we can keep those existing orders in place while returning the authority for future orders back to this Legislative Assembly. The Premier has done his best, as we all have. But we must remember that as members of the House, we were elected to make decisions for the people. Forgetting or abdicating that responsibility is denying people their voice. And I've asked the government, why do you want to extend this authority to make unilateral decisions? Because that is what is at the heart of the declaration. That question has gone unanswered. It has been met with only silence. The government has failed or refused to offer any argument or evidence that would justify continuing these powers. And it is through our collaboration that we have created and agreed to a framework for this House to resume to its proper role. But apparently the government does not want the Assembly and its members to exercise our full functions, rather more the appearance of democracy rather than functional democracy. For absolute clarity, I am not suggesting, not for a moment, that we are out of this crisis. I'm simply saying that the time has come for the advice being received by the Premier alone from Public Health ought to be presented to this House. It ought to be discussed. It ought to be debated. And then we can make decisions on how to move forward, as is intended and required by our system of representative government. COVID has caused a great deal of suffering for a great many people, and that cannot be overlooked or diminished. But there is another tragedy that is not so clearly seen, not so clearly understood. It doesn't make the headlines of the papers. It doesn't capture the nightly newscasts. For the last 2 months, every day from morning to night, I have been on the phone talking with constituents, hearing their trembled voices, listening to their despair. It has been the most emotional and troubling experience. I spoke with a woman whose 58-year-old husband requires a live liver transplant. He is dying. But because that procedure requires the use of 2 ventilators, he cannot get a liver transplant. It was heartbreaking. Really, like, the words cannot describe speaking to her. She had no mechanism to protect or save her loved one. I spoke with another father whose younger daughter had been discovered to have a tumor. But because of COVID, she cannot get the procedure done. Right? It is too dangerous to remove the tumor in a young woman because of COVID. I spoke with a lady, her husband's a roofer, self-employed. And she called me many times, just absolutely overwhelmed. They are going to lose their house. They are going to lose their equipment. They're going to lose their business. They don't qualify for relief. Her husband, through all these confusing and contradictory clauses of the Essential Workplaces Act, is too fearful of going to work because of possible fines. Right? The stories are endless. They're real. They're not in the newspapers, but I'm telling you, they're real. Right? They are the unseen tragedy of what has happened. If I had 12 hours to debate this motion, I could not communicate all of those stories to the people in this House, to the public. A man who had retired and invested his life savings into a new bar and restaurant in Perth. He was meant to open on March 17th, the day we shuttered the hospitality industry. All his pension money, all his savings money, everything that he owns is invested into this restaurant. He has his inventory of beer and spirits. He has his inventory of food. He can't pay his rent. He can't pay his credit lines. He will be bankrupted. The stories, like I said, are heart-wrenching to listen to them. And I'm sure every member in this House has heard similar and equally despairing stories. These are the tragedy, the unseen tragedy of COVID, and they will continue to mount. That's important for us to understand. They will continue to mount under a renewed state of emergency. Because that's the other element of the state of emergency. The state of emergency, the declaration says that is our priority. All these other concerns must take a back seat. These people, our constituents, they've elected us. They've elected us to be their voice. They need a voice during this time because they're not being heard. And they are preventable if we are allowed to do our work. If we are allowed to bring concerns and debate and discuss how policies impact people, we can maybe minimize or mitigate some of them, maybe many of them. I think we can. The spirit of collaboration that I've seen from people clearly demonstrates there is a desire, but we have to have their interests also represented in this House. Speaker, and it's not only constituent concerns, but all these other elements that this House has an obligation to air and to ventilate. But under the state of emergency, the declaration of emergency, are we talking about services for autistic children? No, we're not. Are we talking about Lyme disease? No, we're not. Are we talking about the failures of the Family Responsibility Office? And they have been growing under this time. There is some talk about long-term care, but long-term care has been a problem for decades. Decades. All of us, I'm sure many of the members in this House have submitted many briefs to the current minister and former ministers on how to reform long-term care. I know I have, and I'm sure many others have. What has happened there is again another tragedy. I was not elected to ignore these issues, and we all have the ability to partake in the legislative process. COVID is not over. We've achieved the main objective of not having everyone get sick all at once. We have prevented our healthcare system from being overwhelmed, but it has come at a great cost that is unseen by many. The FAO report has come out with, unsurprisingly, but very frightening facts. This ought to be understood. We ought to be able to inform our constituents of what these consequences are that we'll be facing. But a reaffirmation of the declaration of emergency power will trump that consideration as well. I do commend the Premier for voicing his concerns regarding our province's unpreparedness for pharmaceuticals, PPEs, and our testing capacity. And I agree, we must make it a priority that products and tools are made in Ontario. We have to end our reliance and our dependency on less than trustworthy friends and allies. That has to come to an end. But also the underutilization of our health care, these empty beds. None of these powerfully important subjects are going to be discussed under the declaration of emergency. These are all important debates and discussions, and they cannot happen earnestly while we are under this emergency. I believe it's time that we reclaim our rational inquiry and reasoned deliberations. Remove them back from the hands of arbitrary and unilateral excess. It's time to end the decrees and edicts coming on the fly and sometimes by the seat of our pants. The Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act remains bound by our Constitution, yet no member of this House has had the opportunity to challenge the government on regulations that violate our protected rights of mobility and freedom of assembly. Finally, I will add, and this came up through the discussions with the Government House Leader yesterday, there is a huge and gaping loophole in the existing Emergency Management Act. It is one that none of us understood was there. But within that statute, the loophole allows for the state of emergency to remain indefinitely at the will of the Premier. And there is no means that this House can compel an end to the emergency under the existing legislation. I appreciate the House Leader's commitment to me to amend the legislation expeditiously. And I also commend the House Leader and the government in the manner that they have engaged and facilitated thoughtful negotiations and deliberations with all members of this House during these challenging times. There is work that needs to be done, resolving, correcting, mitigating the many tragedies that this pandemic has exposed is on that list. Remaining locked into a state of emergency impedes and delays our efforts. Let us begin this work without delay, without fear, and without trepidation. Let us lead by example. Thank you, Speaker.